Jasmine Hawkins sat in the back of her sleek black car, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the leather seat as the vehicle glided through the streets of the city. She had done this 1,000 times before, driven through the polished, well-lit streets of luxury and excess, a world that seemed both familiar and foreign to her. At 34, she had already built an empire from the ground up, a billion-dollar tech company that was as groundbreaking as it was influential. She was used to being the center of attention, the woman who defied the odds, who had risen through a sea of doubters and naysayers. Yet as her car drew closer to the hotel, a familiar weight settled in her chest. The knot had tightened the moment she received the reservation confirmation, and now, as the towering structure of glass and steel loomed ahead, she felt it once again, the creeping uncertainty, the quiet tension that always seemed to follow her into places like this. The kind of places where wealth was not just a symbol of success, but a code, a language spoken in hushed tones, wrapped in privilege. A part of her understood it was just business as usual, but another part couldn't help but wonder, would tonight be any different? The hotel stood tall against the city skyline, its facade a mix of modern opulence and stark, cold perfection. The marble floors of the entrance gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, while the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and freshly polished wood. The reception desk, a sleek, polished monolith, gleamed in the center of the room, attended by a young clerk who smiled nervously as she approached. Despite the luxury surrounding her, Jasmine felt the invisible walls closing in. Walls built by years of systemic exclusion and quiet prejudices that no amount of money or success could completely dismantle. Even now, as she prepared to check into what should have been a routine business day, she knew this moment could quickly turn into something far more complicated. She had learned long ago that her skin, her presence, was never fully accepted in these spaces. She had learned how to navigate through them with grace, but tonight felt different. There was an undercurrent of discomfort, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Every movement in the lobby seemed measured, as if people were watching her just a little too closely. Her stride remained confident, but inside her thoughts raced, anticipating the inevitable encounter that lay ahead. In the back of her mind, she braced for what she knew might come next. The questions, the subtle doubts, the judgments disguised as hospitality. This time, it wouldn't be the hotel room she was fighting for. It would be her right to exist within the walls of this world, just as she was. Jasmine Hawkins stepped into the gleaming lobby, the soft click of her heels on the marble floor, resonating through the otherwise quiet space. She moved with the quiet elegance of someone accustomed to being both admired and overlooked, depending on the room she entered. It was a talent she had perfected over the years, commanding attention without demanding it. But tonight, as she approached the front desk, something felt different. The usual smiles and warm greetings she had grown accustomed to were absent. Instead, she noticed a subtle unease in the air, a slight hesitation from the young man behind the counter, a clerk whose name tag read Greg. He had barely looked up from the computer screen when she arrived, his fingers tapping nervously on the keyboard, his posture rigid. Jasmine paused for a moment, assessing him, sensing that something was amiss. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm but authoritative, with just the right amount of warmth. "I have a reservation under Hawkins." She wasn't one for small talk, but the silence that lingered between them as Greg continued to type was thick enough to cut through. He glanced up at her briefly, then back at the screen, his brows knitting together in a puzzled frown. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Greg stammered, clearly flustered. "It seems there's an issue with the reservation. The system isn't showing your payment details properly." His voice faltered, the words spilling out like an apology, but not one that carried much conviction. Jasmine felt the familiar sting of disbelief creeping in. She'd been in this position before, far too many times to count. The moment when she was made to feel like she didn't belong, even in the spaces she had every right to occupy. She straightened, her tone sharpening just slightly. "I've already confirmed the reservation," she said. "There should be no issue." Greg's fingers froze over the keyboard. His gaze flickered up to meet hers, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no understanding of who she was or what she represented. She could tell he was uncomfortable, as if struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the date on the screen. There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause before he nodded, a movement that seemed more out of reflex than genuine agreement. I'll just... He broke off as the phone on the desk rang, its shrill tones slicing through the quiet. Jasmine's patience was already thinning, but she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with this before, countless times, the subtle microaggressions that painted her as an outsider, despite her vast fortune and accomplishments. The clerk's discomfort was not unfamiliar. It was almost predictable. Greg picked up the phone quickly, his voice dipping low as he muttered into the receiver. Jasmine could see the way his shoulders stiffened, his eyes darting nervously between her and the phone. She knew the drill by now, the call to management, the awkward conversation where the system miraculously began to fail the moment a person of her stature walked through the door. She had learned to read these situations like an open book, the pages worn thin from experience. As she stood there waiting for him to finish the call, Jasmine's gaze wandered around the lobby. The space was grand, filled with the usual trappings of wealth, gleaming chandeliers, plush velvet chairs, polished wood accents. It was a place where power and status were on display at all times. Yet it was also a place where she had often felt like an intruder, a reminder of the ways in which people like her, Black women specifically, were rarely welcome in such spaces unless they conformed to expectations. Even her appearance, meticulously put together, was often met with skepticism. She had long ago stopped expecting to be embraced by the world of high society. She simply existed within it, a constant reminder of its contradictions. The phone call ended, and Greg turned back to her, his face unreadable. For a moment, the tension between them thickened. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I'll need to get my manager," Greg said, his voice noticeably more strained now. "Just one moment, please." Before she could respond, he disappeared behind a door leading to the back office. Jasmine stood still, her heart beginning to race. She could feel the familiar tightening in her chest, the sharp edge of frustration cutting through her calm demeanor. She had been here before, forced to wait while her presence was questioned in ways that felt all too familiar. But this time, it was different. The uncertainty in the air was palpable, and as much as she wanted to ignore it, she couldn't. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The lobby had begun to fill with more guests, most of them white, wearing suits and expensive dresses, their conversations hushed and full of the casual ease that came with wealth. Jasmine was used to the way people looked at her, half curious, half dismissive. She was used to the unspoken judgments, the sideways glances, the way her presence was often seen as an anomaly rather than an achievement. It was the price of success in a world where people like her weren't meant to rise. Finally, the door to the back office swung open, and a man stepped into the lobby. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp suit that barely concealed his arrogance. His name tag read, Mr. Andrews. Jasmine immediately knew he was the manager, the one who would decide her fate in this moment. "Good evening," Mr. Andrews said, his voice smooth, but carrying an edge of something more calculating. He took a moment to glance at her, his eyes lingering a fraction too long on her face. His smile, though polite, didn't reach his eyes. "I understand there's an issue with your reservation." Jasmine met his gaze, her own eyes steady and unyielding. "Yes, there seems to be a problem with your system," she said, her voice cool but firm. "I'm sure it can be resolved." Mr. Andrews raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering briefly to the clerk who was still standing off to the side. There was a moment of silence before he spoke again, this time with a touch of condescension creeping into his tone. "It's just that our system sometimes has trouble with certain types of reservations," he said, a false warmth in his words. "It's not uncommon for special requests to get lost in the shuffle, but I'll make sure we sort this out." His smile widened, but there was something cold in it, something she had learned to recognize, the smile of someone who didn't believe she belonged there, no matter how much money she threw at the situation. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she didn't break eye contact. The insinuation hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. She could feel the anger starting to rise within her, but she quelled it. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let this moment define her. She was no longer the girl who needed permission to exist in spaces like this. "I don't need you to sort it out," Jasmine said, her voice even but laced with a quiet fury. "I need you to honor the reservation I made. And I need you to honor the reservation I made. And I need you to do it now." Mr. Andrews' expression faltered for the briefest moment before he masked it with a practiced smile. The tension was thick, and Jasmine could feel the weight of the room's judgment pressing down on her. "I'll have to check with my team," he said, the words almost dripping with dismissiveness. "Then do it," Jasmine replied, her voice sharp. "But I'm not leaving." And just like that, the confrontation was set in motion. What had started as an ordinary check-in was now a battlefield for something much larger. Her right to be here, her right to demand respect, and her right to exist unapologetically in a space that was never meant for someone like her. Jasmine stood in the pristine lobby, her eyes fixed on Mr. Andrews, who was now walking briskly toward the back office, his hand gesturing for the clerk to follow. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her retreating back. That subtle shift in his posture that confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just about the room. It wasn't just a mistake in the system. It was about her, about who she was, about the fact that she didn't belong here. Not in this space, not with this kind of power. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, the heels of her hands digging into her palms. She could feel her heart rate accelerating, that familiar rush of frustration mixing with the sharper edge of anger. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream, to demand that they treat her with the respect she had earned, but she knew better than to let the emotional tide of the moment sweep her away. She had spent years learning to control her reactions, to stay composed even when the world around her was trying to knock her down. But there were times, like now, when the injustice felt too suffocating to simply ignore. The lobby seemed to close in on her as she watched the manager disappear into the back office. The air felt heavier now, thick with a tension that buzzed like static electricity. People were still milling about, sipping cocktails, chatting casually in groups, their voices a constant hum in the background. But the atmosphere had shifted. She could feel the eyes of the other guests on her, some more obvious than others, their gazes lingering just a moment too long, as if they were trying to piece together the situation, trying to figure out what she was doing here. Jasmine knew how it looked. She knew the assumptions that were being made. There was a quiet murmur from a group of older women in the corner, their eyes flicking to her as they exchanged whispers. A man standing near the window eyed her up and down, his gaze lingering on her with just a hint of suspicion, his face unreadable. Jasmine felt the familiar pang of discomfort twist in her stomach. She had been here before. These moments when she felt like an alien in her own skin, when people looked at her as if she didn't belong. They never said it outright, of course. They never needed to. It was all in the unspoken ways they treated her, in the little gestures, the glances, the way the air seemed to tense when she walked into a room. She stood tall, keeping her gaze steady, her posture firm. If they wanted to look, let them look. If they wanted to whisper, let them whisper. She would not shrink. She would not apologize for occupying space in a world that often seemed determined to make her feel like an intruder. The minutes stretched on, and still, no one came to speak to her. The soft clicking of heels echoed through the lobby as more guests moved past her, some offering polite nods, others pretending not to see her at all. The absence of interaction felt like an insult in itself, like they were waiting for her to break, for her to show that she was somehow less capable, less worthy of the privilege they all seemed to take for granted. When Mr. Andrews finally returned, his face was composed, but his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of annoyance that he was trying so hard to conceal. The clerk followed closely behind him, his expression apologetic, his body language tense. He stepped to the side as Mr. Andrews approached, standing just a little too close to him, like an unspoken support, as though they were preparing to shield themselves from something, from her. "We've had some issues with our system, Ms. Hawkins," Mr. Andrews began, his voice smooth, but there was an edge of condescension in the way he spoke her name. "I understand your frustration, but it seems there was a misunderstanding on our end. The payment wasn't processed properly. The words, so carefully chosen, were a deliberate attempt to control the narrative, to shift the responsibility onto something impersonal. Jasmine could hear the underlying implication in his tone. He wasn't just speaking to her as a customer, he was speaking to her as a black woman who had dared to occupy a space of power. He was trying to make her feel small, to make her feel like she didn't belong. She knew this game, and she knew it well. But this time, she wasn't backing down. I don't believe there was a misunderstanding, Jasmine replied, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. I've already spoken to my assistant. My payment was processed days ago. You're not going to tell me that I don't have a reservation when I've already confirmed it multiple times. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. Not this time. Mr. Andrews' smile faltered for just a moment, the briefest crack in his facade. Then it was gone, replaced by a smooth, practiced expression. I'm afraid that's not the issue, Ms. Hawkins, he said. It's not about whether you've paid. It's just that our system flagged your reservation due to the, nature of your request. And, well, he hesitated just enough to make the words land heavier than he intended. We have certain standards for our clientele. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She'd heard this before, though it was always phrased differently, always wrapped in a different package. Standards for clientele. The unspoken message was clear. You don't belong here. It was a message she had spent years learning to deflect, but tonight it hit harder than usual. Her heart pounded in her chest, the anger simmering just below the surface. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much for someone to question her presence in this space. She had fought her entire life for the right to stand in this room, for the right to be seen as someone of worth. And yet here she was, being reduced to a set of assumptions based on her race, based on the color of her skin. I don't believe you understand what you're saying, Mr. Andrews, she said, her voice low but cutting. I don't believe this is about your system or your standards at all. This is about you not wanting someone like me in your hotel. This is about you being uncomfortable with the fact that I don't fit the mold you've built around who belongs in spaces like this. The words hit like a punch, and she saw the briefest flash of surprise cross Mr. Andrews' face before he quickly masked it with another forced smile. That's not what I meant, Ms. Hawkins, he said, his voice suddenly tight, the underlying hostility creeping in, despite his best efforts to conceal it. I'm simply trying to clarify the situation. I don't want this to escalate. But it had already escalated. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air, the way the other guests in the lobby had gone eerily quiet, their eyes darting between her and the manager, sensing that something was wrong but unsure how to react. It was almost as if they were waiting for her to lose control, to play into the very stereotype they had created for her, the one where black women were seen as loud, irrational, angry. I'm not escalating anything, Jasmine said through gritted teeth. I'm simply demanding what I've paid for, and I'm demanding that you treat me with the same respect you would treat any other guest in this hotel. For a moment, the silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mr. Andrews' smile faltered again, and Jasmine could see the way he struggled to regain control of the situation. The clerk shifted nervously beside him, as though he wanted to disappear, to distance himself from the escalating confrontation. But Jasmine wasn't backing down. She had been forced to fight for every inch of ground she had ever gained, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her now. She met Mr. Andrews' gaze with an unwavering stare. You will give me the room I reserved, she said, each word deliberate, unyielding, and you will apologize for wasting my time. Mr. Andrews opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he stood there, his mouth agape, caught between the weight of his own prejudice and the reality of the situation. The lobby was still now, the silence stretching between them, the tension almost unbearable. Jasmine could feel the eyes of every guest on her, their gazes heavy with judgment, their discomfort palpable, but she didn't care. Not anymore. The silence in the lobby thickened, suffocating and charged, as Jasmine stood tall, her gaze locked on Mr. Andrews. His forced smile had vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of barely contained frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For a split second, there was only the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and insistent in her ears. The air felt dense with tension, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Jasmine could see the flicker of indecision in Mr. Andrews' eyes. His gaze darted around, briefly meeting the curious stares of the other guests in the lobby. She could feel their eyes on her, their unspoken judgment radiating through the space. There were those who didn't want to see the truth, who would rather let the moment pass and pretend everything was fine. But there were also those who were watching closely, quietly rooting for her. She could sense their hope, but she could also feel the weight of the invisible forces aligned against her, forces she had spent a lifetime battling. The manager's lips pressed together, his jaw tightening as though he were trying to suppress the words that bubbled up inside him. His gaze flicked to the clerk, who stood awkwardly to the side, still not quite sure whether to intervene or keep quiet. He looked like a man trapped in a situation he didn't know how to navigate. The weight of the moment hung over them all. "You don't understand, do you?" Mr. Andrews finally said, his voice a mixture of exasperation and an almost imperceptible note of disdain. "I don't owe you an apology, Miss Hawkins. You may have the money, but this isn't about money. It's about what we allow in this establishment. It's about who we let in." His words came out in a low growl, and for the first time, there was a shift in his demeanor, a rawness in his voice that exposed the ugly undercurrent beneath his polished professionalism. It was a revelation, and Jasmine felt it like a slap to her face, the full weight of his prejudice now laid bare. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she felt the ground beneath her shift, as if the very foundation of her resolve was cracking. But only for a moment. She refused to let his venomous words rattle her. Instead, an unfamiliar but undeniable sense of clarity washed over her. She had known it, of course. She had known it the moment she set foot in this place, but hearing him say it aloud, there was no turning back now. It was as if the truth of her existence in this world had been distilled into a single crushing sentence. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this hotel, not in this world, not in the spaces that had been built for people who looked nothing like her. The anger bubbled up inside her, hot and sudden, but Jasmine forced herself to stay calm. There was no way she was going to let him see her break. No way she was going to let him think he could push her out so easily. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and in that instant, something inside her snapped into place. "Let me make this clear, Mr. Andrews," Jasmine said, her voice cold, her words deliberate. "I didn't come here for your approval. I didn't come here for your permission. I've paid my dues. I've earned my place, and I'll be damned if you or anyone else gets to tell me I don't belong." Her words rang out in the silence, and for a split second, the entire lobby seemed to freeze, as though time itself had paused. But it didn't last. Suddenly, there was movement behind her. She heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast, deliberate, before a pair of security guards emerged from the side hallway, their uniforms sharp and their expressions unreadable. They were tall, imposing figures, the kind of men whose presence could make a room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. One of them moved to stand beside Mr. Andrews, his posture rigid, while the other positioned himself near the door, blocking the entrance. Jasmine's heart raced. This wasn't just about the room anymore. This was about power, about control, about making sure she understood her place. Mr. Andrews barely spared the guards a glance as they positioned themselves. His gaze never left her, and the smugness that had been creeping back into his demeanor was impossible to miss. "You're making a scene, Ms. Hawkins," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "If you refuse to accept our policies, we may have no choice but to escort you from the premises." The words hit like a punch, each syllable designed to humiliate, to dehumanize. Jasmine's chest tightened, but she refused to flinch. She was no stranger to these moments, these attempts to assert control over her, to remind her of her place. She had fought through every one of them, from boardrooms to city halls to private clubs. But this moment felt different. It was as if the walls were closing in, as if every inch of the ground she had gained was slipping from beneath her feet. "Escort me?" Jasmine repeated, her voice flat, almost mocking. She stepped forward, closing the distance between her and Mr. Andrews. "You really think that's going to work? You think I'm afraid of being escorted out of here?" Her voice grew colder, harder. "If you think for 1 second that your security guards can intimidate me, you're wrong." The guards flinched slightly, but they didn't move. They had been trained to stay still, to follow orders, to exert authority without question. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air growing thicker, the weight of their presence almost suffocating. She stood there, her chin lifted, her gaze steady as she met Mr. Andrew. For a moment it felt as though the entire lobby was holding its breath, suspended in the thick silence that had settled over the scene. "You don't get it, do you?" Mr. Andrews muttered, his voice suddenly laced with a mix of frustration and growing anger. "This isn't about who you are or what you think you've earned. This is about what we decide is acceptable in our establishment. And you—" He motioned to her with a flick of his wrist, a dismissive gesture that spoke volumes. "You are not welcome here. You never were." Her blood ran cold at the finality of his words. They were a declaration, a judgment, a verdict. And as he stood there, arrogantly sure of his power, Jasmine felt an unfamiliar surge of cold fury. She had faced this kind of discrimination before, but there was something about his dismissive tone, the way he tried to break her with his words, that made her feel something much deeper. It was more than just a fight for a hotel room now. It was a fight for her dignity, her worth, her right to take up space in this world without apology. The tension in the room finally snapped when one of the other guests, a woman in her mid-50s, stepped forward from the side of the lobby. Her voice cut through the charged atmosphere, and the words were spoken with a force that seemed to command attention. "Enough," the woman said, her voice strong, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "This is ridiculous. If anyone should be escorted out of here, it's the lot of you." Jasmine turned her head slightly, surprise flickering across her face. The woman's appearance was understated, elegant, composed, but her eyes burned with the fire of someone who had seen enough of this kind of behavior. It was as if she could feel the weight of Jasmine's battle, as if she could see the very injustice of the situation for what it was. "Who do you think you are?" the woman continued, stepping toward the desk, her voice carrying across the lobby. "This woman is a guest, and you are treating her like she's a criminal. You should be ashamed of yourselves." There was a ripple of murmurs from the other guests. Some of them shifted uneasily, while others nodded in silent agreement. Mr. Andrews stiffened, his face flushing with embarrassment. The security guards exchanged a brief glance, but neither made a move to intervene. The weight of the woman's words settled over the room like a wave, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Jasmine felt a shift. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't just a lone black woman standing against a system of silent oppression. The world around her was waking up, slowly but surely, and it felt like the tide was turning. "Thank you," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried with the full weight of gratitude. She wasn't sure if the woman had just saved her or had saved them all from the darkness of their own prejudice. But in that moment, she knew the battle was far from over. But it was one step closer to being won. The air in the lobby felt different now, thinner, as if it had been drawn taut by the tension that had just erupted. The woman's words still echoed in Jasmine's mind, a lifeline in the midst of the chaos, grounding her when she had been ready to break. But the sense of relief was fleeting. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, the adrenaline from the confrontation surging through her, making everything around her seem distant and distorted. Her mind raced, a swirl of thoughts and emotions crashing together in a storm that was hard to navigate. She had stood her ground, yes, but at what cost? The scene had shifted quickly, but Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, scrutinized. Her gaze flickered to the security guards, still standing at attention, their eyes trained on her every movement. They hadn't made a move yet, but the air between them was charged with a quiet menace, as if they were waiting for an excuse, a justification to escalate this into something far uglier. She could feel the weight of their stares, could feel the pressure of their presence looming over her. And for the first time in years, the battle for her own dignity seemed like it could go either way. The woman who had spoken out was still standing near the front desk, her posture resolute, her arms crossed in a way that suggested she wasn't about to back down either. Jasmine watched her for a moment, a strange mix of gratitude and wariness curling in her chest. She wasn't sure whether the woman was an ally or just someone looking to make a point, but she appreciated the support, even if it was a small consolation in the face of such an overwhelming, dehumanizing ordeal. Mr. Andrews, his face flushed with indignation, had clearly lost his composure. He was fumbling for control now, but there was something frantic about the way he moved, as though the situation had spun out of his reach. The tightness in his jaw was noticeable, his movements sharp and erratic. He looked at the two security guards as though silently issuing orders, but neither moved. The clerk beside him, still nervously shifting his weight, glanced between his manager and Jasmine, his face filled with uncertainty. He was just a cog in this machine, Jasmine realized. Another piece of the puzzle, unwilling or unable to step out of the shadows of his superiors. In that moment, Jasmine saw him for what he was, a man complicit in something he didn't have the strength to question. She knew that look well, the one that seemed to say, "I didn't ask for this," but still stayed silent in the face of it. Then the sound of the front door opening broke through the tension. The sharp click of boots on polished marble echoed in the lobby as two more security officers arrived. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions unreadable, but the look in their eyes said it all. There was a new level of authority now, one that felt oppressive, heavy. The situation was escalating, and not in a way that promised resolution. "Is there a problem here?" one of the new officers asked, his voice hard and official, his gaze cutting straight to Jasmine. She stood tall, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "I'm not the one causing the problem," she said, her voice calm, but the anger simmering beneath the surface was undeniable. "Your colleagues were just about to escort me out without any reason other than the color of my skin." The officer glanced over at Mr. Andrews, who was now visibly sweating, his lips pressed tight. He didn't speak, didn't defend himself. His failure to respond was its own kind of admission. But the officer wasn't looking at him. He was looking at her, as if trying to assess whether she was the one who needed to be dealt with. "You're going to have to come with us, ma'am," the second officer said, his tone colder than the first, more authoritative. "We can sort this out in private." Jasmine's stomach turned. It was happening. She could feel it, that familiar, sickening sense of being cornered, of being trapped. They weren't listening to her anymore. They were just trying to silence her, to make her disappear. It wasn't even about the hotel anymore. It was about control. It was about maintaining the narrative that someone like her, someone who had dared to walk into this space, had no right to take up space, no right to be seen. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering. She wasn't sure whether the words were meant for the officer or for herself, but they felt like a promise, like a declaration she would not back down from. "You're going to get your manager here to explain why you're trying to remove me from this hotel when I've done nothing wrong." The officer's eyes narrowed, the hint of a sneer curling on his lips as he took a step closer, his hand hovering near his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. "We don't have time for this, ma'am. You're creating a disturbance. If you refuse to comply, we'll have to take further action." "Take action, then," Jasmine snapped, her voice cold, her heart pounding. She knew the risks, knew that it could escalate in a heartbeat. She knew the consequences of standing up, of resisting in a place like this, in a world like this. But what other choice did she have? To go quietly? To let them walk all over her? To let them send a message that she, a black woman, was nothing more than a nuisance to be eliminated? Number she had fought too long and too hard to let them strip her of her dignity now. The officer's hand moved to his radio, his fingers hovering over the button. Jasmine held her breath, waiting for the call that would change everything. But before he could speak, the door to the back office opened, and Mr. Andrews stepped forward, his face a mix of frustration and something darker, something more calculating. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. "Get her out of here." Jasmine's heart sank, and for a moment, the weight of everything came crashing down on her. But then, something unexpected happened. The woman who had stood up for her earlier stepped forward again, her voice calm but firm. "You're not taking her anywhere," she said, standing between Jasmine and the security officers. "You will not remove her from this hotel. I'll call my lawyer, and I'll make sure this entire situation is documented." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The officers looked at each other, uncertain. Mr. Andrews' jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. The woman, resolute and unwavering, was now standing as a barrier, her body language clear. She wasn't going to back down, and neither was Jasmine. The backup hadn't arrived yet, but it didn't matter. The tide had shifted. Jasmine's heart was still racing, her nerves still on edge. But the surge of empowerment that coursed through her in that moment was undeniable. They were not going to win this. Not today. Not while she, the second officer, after a brief exchange of silent glances with his partner, finally stepped back. He didn't apologize. He didn't say anything, but he had retreated for now. The woman's intervention had bought them time, but Jasmine knew it was only a matter of time before the situation would intensify again. She wasn't safe yet. She wasn't done. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt like she might just be able to make it through. The weight of the night's events pressed down on Jasmine as she sat in the quiet solitude of her hotel room, the city lights casting long shadows across the floor. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: rage, disbelief, exhaustion. But beneath it all, there was a quiet, simmering determination. She had come to a realization in the moments after the confrontation. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about one unjust encounter in a hotel lobby. It was about a larger systemic issue, an issue that reached into the very fabric of society, one that used the false promises of civility to mask the deep-rooted prejudices that pervaded every corner of life. Her fight, as exhausting and isolating as it was, wasn't just for her dignity. It was for everyone who had ever been forced to endure the quiet, insidious weight of discrimination, the kind that lurked in the shadows, disguised as authority and civility. As Jasmine stared at the phone in her hands, the room around her fading into the background, she could hear the faint buzz of a message notification. It was from her assistant, a reminder of a board meeting in the morning, of the things that still needed to be done in the business empire she had spent years building. But the meeting, the contracts, the strategies, none of that mattered now. In the wake of the humiliation, the shame that had been thrust upon her, Jasmine knew she couldn't simply walk away and let this pass. She wasn't going to let the memory of this moment fade into the background of her life. She had been taught to be resilient, to never let the weight of the world break her. But this had cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced. A knock on the door broke her thoughts, and when she opened it, she was met with the woman who had stood up for her earlier, the one whose voice had helped shift the tide in the lobby. She entered quietly, her presence calming, but no less determined than before. "I know you're probably exhausted," the woman began, her voice gentle but firm. "But I want you to know I'm here to help. I know a few people in law enforcement who are taking this seriously. We need to make sure this goes beyond tonight. What happened to you cannot just be ignored." Jasmine's chest tightened, but she nodded slowly, grateful for the unexpected support. The weight of the decision still loomed large in her mind. She had always known that taking a stand could be costly, but in that moment, as she faced the woman who had risked her own comfort to defend her, something inside her clicked into place. This wasn't just about making a statement or getting justice for herself. It was about fighting for change. If she backed down now, if she let it slide, if she pretended it hadn't happened, the cycle of racial injustice would continue to thrive, unseen and unchecked, and that she couldn't allow. The conversation between the two women shifted toward the next steps, filing a formal complaint, reaching out to lawyers, and even considering contacting the press. It wasn't about revenge, Jasmine knew. It was about making sure the incident wasn't swept under the rug, about sending a message that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. As they spoke, a quiet resolve settled in her chest. She was done being passive. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and achieved too many milestones to let this moment define her as a victim. She would take action, and she would make sure that others who had suffered similar treatment were empowered to do the same. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Mr. Andrews and the security officers were facing the consequences of their actions. The arrival of backup had only been the beginning. The hotel's upper management had quickly gotten involved, and the police had been called to de-escalate the situation. But even then, the damage had been done. Word had gotten out. Guests who had witnessed the exchange were already beginning to speak up, and the hotel's reputation, once pristine, was starting to unravel. Jasmine's experience had become a rallying cry for those who had felt similarly marginalized, and for the first time in a long while, there was hope that something could change. In the following days, there were meetings, endless meetings with law enforcement, with her lawyer, with public relations teams. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, how it could have gone so wrong, and what steps needed to be taken to ensure accountability. Jasmine was exhausted, but she kept pushing forward. She couldn't afford to stop now. Too much was at stake. In the police station, a quiet but growing conversation was taking place about accountability. The officers who had initially responded to the scene were summoned to explain their actions. The first officer, the one who had been quick to demand Jasmine's compliance, was being questioned by his superiors. His explanation, cold and evasive, failed to satisfy anyone in the room. He claimed he had only been doing his job, following the manager's instructions, but there was an undercurrent of defensiveness that suggested he knew the situation had escalated unnecessarily. The second officer, the one who had stepped back after the woman's intervention, found himself under even more scrutiny. The truth was, the officers had acted with a shocking lack of sensitivity. There had been no consideration given to the fact that the woman involved was not just any guest. She was a high-profile, successful entrepreneur, a figure who commanded respect. Instead, they had allowed their biases to dictate the course of action, responding with force before even attempting to understand the situation. "Do you honestly believe this is how we should be handling situations like this?" one of the senior officers asked, his voice low and pointed as he addressed the officer who had called for backup. "This could have been avoided, but you escalated it with no regard for the woman's dignity. That's unacceptable." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. It was clear that the conversation was about more than just this one incident. It was about the patterns of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. The department knew that public trust was fragile, and incidents like this could undo years of progress. There was no easy way out. There was no pretending the situation hadn't happened. Across town, Jasmine sat in a small conference room with her legal team. They were going over the details, preparing a statement that would be released to the media. She had been clear from the beginning. This wasn't just about seeking personal compensation or an apology. This was about holding people accountable for their actions, about making sure that no one else would ever have to go through the same humiliating experience. And it was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could dehumanize people because of their race. "We'll file a formal complaint," her attorney said, tapping the table lightly with his pen. "But we're also going to make sure we put pressure on local officials to take a closer look at this hotel's practices. We'll reach out to the media, and we'll make sure this isn't just swept under the rug. This could be a turning point, Jasmine." Jasmine nodded, feeling a surge of determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was going to see this through. She was going to make sure that what had happened to her wasn't just another forgotten incident. She wasn't going to let the people who tried to strip her of her dignity get away with it. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be obstacles along the way, but she was ready to fight for change, for accountability, and for justice. As the days passed, the hotel, once an institution of exclusivity, found itself under a spotlight it had never expected. The social media backlash was swift, the public outrage growing as more people began to share their own stories of discrimination. What had started as a personal battle for Jasmine had quickly become a movement, one that was calling for real change, change that would make sure no one else had to face what she had endured. Jasmine stood tall amidst it all, her resolve unwavering. This wasn't just about one moment. It was about rewriting the rules, about ensuring that this kind of injustice would no longer be tolerated. And as the days stretched into weeks, she knew that this fight, though exhausting, was one worth every ounce of her strength. Jasmine stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the city that had always felt like a place of opportunity, a place where dreams could take flight. But in the wake of everything that had happened, the city felt different now. It felt like a battleground, a place where every step forward had to be earned, fought for, and sometimes even bled for. The wind whispered through the trees below, carrying with it the faint sounds of the world continuing, of life moving on despite the struggles that marked its path. But Jasmine knew something had shifted within herself. The fight she had found herself in was not just hers to bear. It was a battle that belonged to every person who had ever been silenced, ignored, or unjustly pushed aside. It was a fight against a system that had long worked to keep people like her in the shadows, a system that used its power to strip away the humanity of those it deemed lesser. The process had been exhausting, but it had also been eye-opening. The media coverage had spread far and wide, forcing the hotel and its staff to face the consequences of their actions, to confront the ugliness of their implicit biases and discriminatory practices. Jasmine's case had become a rallying cry, a symbol for all those who had been forced to endure the indignity of being judged by the color of their skin, the sound of their voice, or the way they carried themselves in spaces that were never meant for them. And as the walls of silence began to crack, she realized that the true power wasn't just in her ability to fight back in the moment, it was in the collective action that followed, in the solidarity of those who refused to stay silent, in the voices that rose together to demand accountability and justice. But this wasn't the end. Jasmine knew the road ahead was still long. There would be more battles, more systems to challenge, more moments of doubt to overcome. The world was not going to change overnight. But she had learned something invaluable throughout the process, that the fight against the systemic racism and injustice wasn't about waiting for someone else to fix it. It was about standing up even when the weight of the world felt unbearable and pushing for the change that was needed. With each passing day, Jasmine's resolve only grew stronger. She knew that real change would come not through isolated acts of resistance, but through a movement, a sustained collective effort to reshape the systems that upheld inequality. She thought of the people who had supported her along the way, the woman who had stood by her in the hotel lobby, the lawyers and activists who had helped amplify her voice. They weren't just allies. They were a part of something much bigger, something that was moving and shifting, not as one isolated fight, but as a unified effort that spanned across cities, across communities, across generations. As Jasmine turned away from the balcony, the promise she had made to herself lingered in her mind. She wouldn't just be a footnote in someone else's story. She would be the change, the spark that ignited a fire that couldn't be snuffed out. She had fought for her dignity, yes, but she had also fought for the dignity of others, for the future of those who would never have to face the same injustice that she had. And in that fight, she had found her purpose. The fight wasn't over, and it would never be easy. But as Jasmine walked toward the door, her eyes steady and her heart resolute, she knew one thing for sure. Change was not just a possibility, it was a necessity, and she would keep pushing for it, one step, one voice, one moment at a time.